The main place that I distributed it was the Hong Kong Sevens to the national women's coaches. And as I said before, the International Rugby Board sent a questionnaire to the regional development officers and national coaches. My first question that I asked them, what category would you perceive women's 15s and 7s rugby to be in? As you can see, the 15s perception is still amongst the top. Rugby coaches are still saying that they see it 51% as masculine. But the 7s perception, they're saying they see it more neutral as 72%. Now this question lies on that for countries that are actually seeing rugby for the first time through Olympic inclusion, 7s is going to be their first impression of rugbies. So is it in fact going to be a neutral perception to start off when people say rugby, women's rugby in particular? Question 3. Do you think the Olympic inclusion will change the perception of women's rugby? As you can see, 92% said yes, the Olympic inclusion will in fact change 7s rugby perception. Okay, question 4. What sports do you see as having athletes compatible for 7s, not including rugby? In the results, we found that the top number was athletics that coaches are choosing from: soccer, basketball, wrestling, and handball. 4 out of 5 of those sports are gender-neutral sports. So what remains to be seen is that do perceptions come with the athlete that comes over to the sport, or do the perceptions stay within the sport? Question 5. Room A has 12 top athletes from your above selected sports. Room B has 12 top rugby players from your country. What percentage of each room would you choose if selecting a squad now for the 2016 Olympics? In selecting a future Olympic 7s team, coaches would choose 45% athletes from other compatible sports, 55% top rugby players from their country. Now this is women's rugby. If you think of women's football, I mean, it would probably be a lot higher actually choosing women's football players from your country. It's just that women's rugby has such a low development rate of rugby players that coaches are actually looking to other sports. An example for this is the Japan setup for choosing athletes. The population for Japan is fantastic, except for those that don't know, the structure of Japan is that a lot of companies own the sports. So for example, my husband coaches Rico Rugby. Rico Rugby owns the rugby team. They also own a baseball team, a volleyball team, a track and field team. And so what happens is the players play for the company. And what the company gets out of it is that once they finish playing for the company, they have a lifetime job. So the company hires them to play, they have a lifetime job. If they choose to be professional in the rugby, then they lose their lifetime job. So a lot of the players will stay amateur, so to speak, still get paid and get all the perks, but they stay within the company. Now, when we have to choose from athletes, we've got the best 400-meter sprinter in the country. She really wants to play for women's 7s, except that she belongs to a company and she'll have to give up her lifetime job for it. So it's a big ask when it's actually affected during the culture. Media coverage, a huge impact on how people are going to perceive women's 7s rugby, especially with the Olympics coming up. As you can see in the last 3 major tournaments in the last 6 months, the Asian Games in the final, women's final, 30,000 people watching. Las Vegas 7, 25,000 people watching. And for the first time in American history, NBC aired the men's version of the Las Vegas 7s. And the commentators keep saying over and over again, imagine all the footballers, the American footballers watching this today. If they don't make their professional team, it's an easy transfer to be on the Olympic team. Hong Kong Sevens, the last one that I was at, 30,000 people watching the women's final. Outstanding numbers for women's rugby. Funding. Funding is actually a huge, important aspect in every sport, in every women's sport. The Canadian women's rugby team is actually leading with Own the Podium. Own the Podium has dedicated $1.5 million over the next 2 years to the Canadian women's 7s team. An important note to make, though, too, is the podium is giving 1.5 million to the Canadian women's team. They're not giving it to the men's. So that shows that countries are looking at this soft medal. Okay? Netherlands, they're going to be the first team come September to be fully professional in the women's sevens. And they've already got lots of funding into them, and in the last 3 major tournaments, they've come in the top 3. Brazil is getting 240,000 this year, which is a huge improvement. And Japan, here we train at the National Training Center, a first for the Japan women, so where every 2 months we meet, and we get all the facilities from the National Training Center in Tokyo. So in conclusion, women's rugby. Athletes will still soon see the benefits they have of coming to women's sevens rugby. The 5th place runner on the USA team might want to come over and play rugby. Track and field, coaches are looking for them. What remains to be seen, though, is if perceptions will change while these neutral sport athletes are coming over to rugby. And like I said before, is it the perceptions that lie within the athlete, or is it the perceptions that lie within the sport? Nicole back there in the far right corner. Heather Moyse. Heather Moyse is a good friend of mine. She's won the bobsled at the Vancouver Olympics. She set record-breaking numbers in the bobsled. In the last 7 years of her preparation for rugby, 7 years and 2 World Cups, she attended 3 tournaments and probably a handful of club games in rugby. She's a fullback, fantastic, outstanding athlete who has 7% body fat, yet she's only touched the rugby ball over that 7 years a handful of times. 2002, she was the top 2006, she was the top try scorer at the World Cup, and in 2010, at last year's World Cup, she was the 2nd top try scorer, with only a handful of touches on the ball within the 7 years. And so that concludes, nice and short, my presentation today, but what I want to leave with you as a coach, and a different perspective, more scientific perspective, is if countries like Japan and the USA and the coaches that I've talked to are choosing, out of 12 players, they're choosing 2 or 3 rugby players. The rest are choosing from other sports now. What we have to do, and what the challenge of the coach is what out of those 2 and 3 rugby players, why are we choosing them, and what skills do we need to take from them to teach the new athletes? What I mean by this is that the 2 or 3 athletes that you're choosing, maybe decision making, what are the important elements in rugby and rugby league that we need to take from these 3 athletes and focus on in the next 5 years to create an Olympic team to teach these new athletes. Thank you very much for listening. And last thing, I want you to picture now in your head your perception of women's sevens rugby. Picture and hands up. Can anyone tell me that it's actually different from your first perception of women's rugby? Good. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions or comments?
Thank you very much. It's time for questions.
Kelly, I take it you played the 15s version when
Yeah.
you played?
15s and 7s, yeah.
Played both?
Yeah.
How would you just sum up the differences between the 15s and the 7s game?
The 15s and 7s game. Fitness, definitely. Fitness and speed. Difference in those terms of characteristics or elements, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say for what we focus on is fitness and speed and the ability to create space. I think the decision making and be able to create space, the 2-on-1s, is so much more important than 7s, given the space that we have as athletes.
I don't want it to sound too simple, but if you can run fast and carry the ball,
Yeah.
You're a good chance to play 7s.
Yes. That's my perception anyway, so yeah. That's why we're looking to other sports.
Do you see that perception change? Do Do you see that perception changing in the lead up to the Olympics, so in the next 5 years, that rather than just being a fast athlete, you'll have to bring some more of those other skills to the table?
Yeah, as far as perception of the skills that they're bringing? Yes, I think so. I think what's happening right now is everyone's in a race right now to find the athletes now, and that develop them into the best rugby players they can for the next 5 years. So I think in the next couple of years, it's kind of a panic attack to see what they can do, who's doing what. There's no research in women's sevens rugby. So everybody's trying to do the best thing now for the next 2 years, and then for 3 years, they'll take those athletes and transfer them into rugby players, hopefully.
Other questions?
Within women's rugby, is the drive to get athletes from other sports or to develop rugby players, women's rugby players within rugby?
Well, that's the magic question. That's what I asked a lot of the coaches. Are you looking to develop your rugby players within? And I'd say from the countries that rugby isn't a priority sport, or is not even in the top 10, they're just going automatically to the athletes, and then they'll develop them from there. But as far as countries like New Zealand and England and South Africa and Australia, I think they're really trying to look into how well they can develop their rugby players into being international athletes. And
would it not be best to develop women's rugby players? Because as much as sevens, it's acknowledged it has a high speed component. If you pick up a track runner, you run fast, that's going to be helpful, but it's not my view, I'm just putting it out there. Would it not be best to develop female women's rugby players who actually understand the game, which takes a long period of time, and develop that culture of strategy and ability to play the game rather than just having athletes?
I totally agree with you, but I'll pose this question to you. Given that at the World Cup, the top 3 try scorers were 3 years or less, if you're choosing your team now for the Olympics, and a top athlete like that would make a difference on your podium, would you choose the top athlete or would you choose the rugby?
I guess you're looking at short versus long-term gains.
I can see, like, long-term, I'm talking about the next Olympics coming up. I think because natural athletes have such a dominating effect on the game as it is, they're just making huge impacts. An example, when we were coaching the Japan Academy, when we first started it, we had 7 athletes from basketball, soccer, never played the game before. We played them against our rugby players that had played for a long time. The natural athletes beat them. So that's the impact that, on the women's game. Men's game different, because you have such a bigger pool, but the women's game is really struggling for those top athletes because they go to other sports.
Just one last question. What type of scientific work would you like the audience to do within women's rugby over the next years before 2016?
Oh, I'd love more GPS. GPS is just starting, which is fantastic for the sevens game. Yeah, good question. I mean, my field, what I like to talk about is perceptions, and to actually see what type of athletes and the range of athletes that go through the system in 2016, and actually how much experience they have leading up to the Olympics.
Thank you very much. It's now time to close the session. We hope that you enjoyed it, and it's now time for a coffee break. Thank you.